Hello and welcome to another episode of Planet Holyrood, the podcast all about Scottish politics. I'm Chris McCall, I'm the Deputy Political Editor at the Daily Record, and I'm standing in as presenter this week as Paul Hutchin is off enjoying the Edinburgh festivals. And joining me for this week's episode are two people who need no introduction to regular listeners. On my left, John Ferguson, the editor of the Sunday Mail, and on my right, Douglas Dickie, the content editor at the Scottish Daily Express. Now, with a Scottish Labour leadership contest underway and a recent Holyrood election win under their belts, you might think this summer would be a time for the SNP to collectively kick back and put their feet up before the Scottish Parliament resumes from its 2-month-long holiday next month and the real hard work of government begins. But you would be wrong, because with impeccable timing, Nicola Sturgeon is very much back in the news as she continues what must rank as one of the world's longest running promotional tours for a book. The paperback edition of Frankly, her political memoir, which was first published a year ago, is out this week, and the former First Minister had lots to say in a 6,000-word foreword, especially written for the paperback edition. And that included some choice observations about our party's performance at the recent Holyrood election. Now, we won't go into all of them, but we'll try and give you the gist. Well, she said that the SNP result was one for celebration. She did say that the SNP's pitch lacked, quote, vision or big picture thinking, suggested the wider campaign was detached from the big issues bearing down on people's lives, and also warned that the SNP's got to be careful about losing or damaging its environmental credentials, as that could open them up to losing votes to the Scottish Greens. Now, John, I'll come to you first. Just how delighted do you think John Swinney is to hear these helpful comments from his old colleague?
So I'm pretty sure John Swinney would have been absolutely furious when he read about this. We do have to caveat here. I've not read this 6,000 word foreword to the latest edition of Nicola's book, but the reports are true, and she is having a dig at John Swinney and the SNP generally. Then it does sound like she, an incredible brass neck. If you like, I think anyone would agree that the biggest problems that John Swinney's faced as First Minister are the problems that he inherited from Nicola Sturgeon, and the easiest thing for John Swinney to have done to move past those would have been to hang Nicola Sturgeon out to dry, particularly on, the Peter Murrell case. Nicola Sturgeon was the leader of the party, Peter Murrell's wife, without suggesting that she was somehow responsible for any of Peter Murrell's crimes. There was still clearly a reasonable conclusion to be drawn from her predecessor that she needs to bear some responsibility for everything that's gone on, and that she had a duty to know what was going on, even if she claims that she didn't. Now, John Swinney didn't choose that path. He has been incredibly loyal to Nicola Sturgeon in ways that have clearly been to his detriment politically, but I think it's probably is just his personality. He's just not the kind of guy who would decide to put the knife in when a former colleague and friend was down.
Yep.
Now, it does seem remarkable that Nicola Sturgeon then, after that display of complete unflinching loyalty, not just from John Swinney, but from really everyone in the upper echelons of the SNP government at the moment, for Nicola to now start poking a bit of criticism at John Swinney and all of her former colleagues in government, and to suggest that essentially if only she was still in charge, everything would be fine.
Yeah. I mean, there has been, I would hesitate to use the word backlash. That would be a bit strong, but we have had, Mary McCall was asked about this, and she described it as a nonsense, the kind of suggestion the SNP had run anything less than a successful campaign. We also, though, Dougie, going to ask you to pick up on this point. Angela Constance, the now Health Secretary, was asked about Nicola Sturgeon's observations last night, and Angela Constance, I'm going to read the full quote here actually. She said, with respect, no, she's not correct, and as in Nicola Sturgeon is not correct. I've been a minister for a number of years. I've had the great privilege of serving all SNP First Ministers. And what I will say about John Swinney is that we have the best First Minister yet. I'm presuming this is a viewpoint that the Scottish Daily Express is right behind. Swinney being the great man of Scottish politics, is he not?
Well, if John Swinney's the best, then my God, Nicola Sturgeon and whom's a Yusuf must have been absolutely hopeless. I nearly said useless there, but I mean, I thought Angela Collins is, she's obviously, I think she's quite close to John Swinney. Her comments were much more biting, I thought, than Mary McCall, who of course is seen by many as a bit of a Sturgeon clone. She was a special advisor.
She was a special advisor, yeah.
And she's kind of seen as the heir apparent to Sturgeon, although Sturgeon also had a bit of a pop at some of those who were maybe lined up to replace Swinney.
Did, yeah.
Another comment that I noticed from Constance is when she said John Swinney was a firm nationalist. I mean, I don't think that's particularly, that's not a compliment in my book, but he seems to think she seems to think it would be, but he's a nationalist and a firm supporter or a dedicated supporter of Scottish independence. Is that a suggestion that maybe Nicola Sturgeon isn't quite as devoted to the cause as she would have you believe? I just thought it was a real interesting.
Well, we did have, Alex Neil has been a critic of both Nicola Sturgeon and John Swinney on multiple occasions, but he was speaking to me earlier this week and he suggested that Nicola Sturgeon now has more in common with the Scottish Greens on many of the big issues than she does with the SNP.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if I agree with that entirely, but I have seen other people suggest that if Nicola Sturgeon was going to stand for Parliament again, would she do it under the Green banner rather than the SNP?
I mean, I can't see that. I think it's more that she appears to have been, she's, despite her, waxing lyrical about her love of Ireland, she's chosen London to go and kind of escape the glare here, and she seems to be enjoying life in that that city. I know she's a fan of London, and I think there's a perception among certain elements of the independence movement that she's been suckered in a bit by that kind of London lifestyle and that London vibe, if you like. But I mean, the one word that comes to mind with all this is narcissist. I mean, someone that just a complete lack of self-awareness. Someone who's spent her entire career being told that she's right by a bunch of yes men and yes women that she surrounds herself by, and she doesn't seem to have accepted the reality that she just refuses to take responsibility for it. She same in 2024, and Mary McCall can big up the election result all they want, but the fact is John Swinney made a majority his goal, so they failed in their stated goal at that election. The fact that they were so far ahead of second place has got more to do with the rise of reform than anything the SNP have done. So Sturgeon just refuses to take responsibility for any of it. And I've got to say, if she thinks that the answer to the SNP's issues are be more like the Scottish Greens, then I've got to say she's well wide of the map.
I should say that just before we started recording this, John Swinney was, I believe, up in Broughty Ferry, where he was asked about Nicola Sturgeon's comments today, and chiming with what you said, John Swinney just refusing to fan the flames in this. He was asked if he felt betrayed by Nicola Sturgeon, and the First Minister responded he was delighted to have his own mandate, said, I enjoyed working for Nicola Sturgeon as our Deputy First Minister, and I delivered along with her significant improvements in the lives of people in Scotland, but I'm absolutely over the moon to have my own mandate. And then asked if he'd spoken to Nicola Sturgeon about her comments, John Swinney said, I'm not going to divulge my private conversations. So he's very much not pouring fuel on the fire. However, before we move on to something else, we should say that this Saturday, Nicola Sturgeon will be back at the Edinburgh Fringe, where she's in conversation with Ian Dale. Now, I hope he enjoyed that free plug that I've just given him. But John, do you think Nicola Sturgeon will choose to walk back from this, or do you think she's got more to say?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect what she's will have said to John Swinney if there has been a conversation, and there probably has been a conversation, is
Comments,
look, John,
yes, so-
my comments have been taken completely out of
Yeah.
context. I've not been slagging you off. Like this is a newspaper creation, and I'd imagine John Swinney must have accepted that to some extent. Whether Nicola will be able to help herself going further when she's interviewed by Ian Dale remains to be seen. I mean, look, I think anyone looking at this, kind of any impartial observer on recent history of the SNP can see that, that Angela Constance is incorrect. By far the towering figure of the SNP's modern history was Alex Salmond, and in terms of second place, well, history's still being written, but it would be a toss-up between Nicola Sturgeon and John Swinney. Nicola Sturgeon was actually extremely popular for a long time, but then the wheels kind of started to come off in the last couple of years. Now, if you want to look at what were the policies that led to that, there was the position on trans rights, which had become deeply unpopular and just really impossible to defend in a kind of logical sense. And there was also the oil and gas issue. Now, these are both the things that I think the primary things that John Swinney's tried to sort of roll back on in his time as First Minister. And I think that's probably been in large part responsible for the party's kind of being a bit reinvigorated in the polls and kind of coming back into popularity with large sections of public. So I just think it's, really pretty, I say, I think it was lacks introspection for Nicola Sturgeon to look at this and think, I was the best thing that ever happened to this party, and if only John had carried on with the policies that I was championing, then things would have been even better, and they would somehow maybe have achieved that majority that he was going for and would be in a better position now. I don't think anyone who can capable of taking a step back and looking at it really believes that.
Just on a related note to the Scottish election campaign, where one of the many things that the SNP had promised was a new hospital in Monklands, basically between Airdrie and Coatbridge in North Lanarkshire. Now, this has been talked about for decades, I believe, but certainly way back to the 2000s, the existing Monklands Hospital in Airdrie is basically falling apart. The NHS is already spending millions just to keep it open, and a site has been identified where a new hospital probably will be built in time, but we don't know when, because the plan that people thought was going to be signed off ultimately wasn't. And on the final day of the Scottish Parliament session in June, Angela Constance stood up to tell MSPs it was being ditched, it was being sent back to the drawing board and wouldn't be progressing with it. And basically the kind of fallout from that continues to now. Alec Neil, the former Health Secretary, who's former MSP for Airdrie, who was succeeded by Gray, who is until May the Scottish Government Health Secretary. Alex Neil been very critical of this decision. Now, I'll come to you in a minute, John, because I know you've done a lot on this in the Sunday Mail, but Dickie, is this kind of an indictment of the SNP taking voters for a ride here? Because we did have the sight of Neil Gray and John Swinney campaigning side by side in Airdrie before the votes.
So, I mean, this story, we were discussing it off air, Chris. This is a real brewing scandal for me. This might be one of the biggest, actually, of the last kind of 10 years. And Neil Gray, and you've got to assume John Swinney knew that they were being advised, that the advice was not to go ahead with the project, and yet campaigned on it in Neil Gray's constituency, incidentally. One now is led to wonder, is this why Neil Gray is no longer Health Secretary? Is it an attempt to kind of distance him from this, knowing that this was probably going to come out? And I think what's amazing about it is just how easily the SNP find it to lie to voters, and that's what it's, that's what it is. As far as I'm concerned, it's a lie. They have campaigned on a lie. He has been elected on a lie.
I know Neil Hay would argue
easy.
that it's not been scrapped, it's been delayed, but would you accept that?
No, I mean, just I think it's an absolute disgrace. This, I really do. I think Neil Gray should be ashamed of himself. If John Swinney knew about it, he should be ashamed of himself. If he didn't know about it, Neil Gray should be sacked. I think both of them should be. If both of them knew about it, they should both be considering their positions. And it's just they don't even seem to care. And especially now, we're 5 years away from the next election, so they've got another 5 years of spin and bluster and mistruth against voters. But I mean, I just think it's. I really think this one will run and run. I think it will grow arms and legs, and it'll be another one that the SNP lose control of, and yet just shut up shop. And the way they just brazen these things out, I think is really quite depressing.
John, tell me, I think it was in April, the Sunday Mail was reporting that the Scottish Government was aware of concerns from within the NHS that this Monklands replacement project, the costs were running out of control. And there was serious concerns about how deliverable it was. But did you kind of run a brick wall with trying to confirm that form with the Scottish Government?
And so it's become a story in the last couple of weeks that the government appear to have known before the election that this project was going to get scrapped and didn't say anything until afterwards. Sunday Mail readers, however, would have been aware before the election because we ran a front page story about 1 or 2 weeks before the election saying just this, that John Swinney had drawn up a list of secret cuts, primary among them being that the Monklands Hospital development wouldn't be going ahead in its intended form. Now, the basis of that story was that the local authority had submitted many, many months prior to that their full business case, which they had been assured would be rubber stamped in a matter of weeks. That hadn't happened. There were very well stood up reports of a meeting having taken place around a month or two, I think, from memory, before the election between NHS officials, Scottish Government, and it would appear that at that meeting a decision has been taken. We just can't, the costs are now too high. It's interesting, like the question, did they campaign in this? They didn't really. That was the further evidence that clearly the project had been ditched. If you look at all of the electioneering information that was going out, and you have to remember this was Ian Gray's constituency, so so the potential fallout from it becoming public before the election that this was getting ditched could have been catastrophic. So you look at, compared with the election before that, it was absolutely front and centre of all of the campaigning in that constituency was the fact that this hospital was going to be delivered. It was completely dropped from any of the election material prior to the latest Holyrood election. I think it was quite clear why, because they obviously knew that that project wasn't going to go ahead because the costs had spiralled out of control. Yeah, I think if you look at what the deeper issue here, I think you're obviously right that they knew and they realised that it would have been politically expedient to just bury this until after the election. I think the sort of more profound issue here is how can you proceed with any public contract if it now costs, £2 billion to build a hospital that just a couple of years ago was meant to cost, I think, 800 million. There is a real problem. We see the same thing with trying to rebuild Berlin.
Yeah, it could cost $1 billion.
Many other things, like what used to cost millions is suddenly ballooned into billions, and we've got crumbling infrastructure. How can you progress?
And I think on that positive note, we'll draw to a conclusion today. I know on not certainly the Monklands issue, this is going to be something that's been talked about for years, sadly, as it could be well into the 2030s by the time that we see a new hospital built. And certainly on the issue of Nicola Sturgeon, I'm sure there'll be
I think just quickly, John, when you were saying about how they didn't campaign on it, I take that point, but your average voter thinks Monkland Hospital is going to happen.
Oh yeah.
And so they've kind of led voters up a garden path. Yeah.
I mean, it will happen.
No, there's no doubt. That doesn't take away from the point. Yeah, there was definitely a few weeks before the John Swinney and the Health Secretary had been out on the site with spades, showing this is where the hospital's going to be. So it wasn't completely absent from the politics running up to the election.
So yeah, well, no, not at all. I mean, we could talk about this and other examples for several hours because there are obviously, as John points out, this is just one of the major infrastructure projects which the Scottish Government has to deal with at a time when the cost of delivering them is eye-watering, especially when they are facing a £5 billion black hole in the public finances that is to be plugged by 2030. So there are no easy answers here. Obviously, we would argue as journalists they should just be upfront and honest about this, but then again, it's not us that are standing.
Thankfully, we've got the best First Minister ever in charge.
Well, that's it. Yeah, as Angela Constance tells us. Thank you to John and to Dickie for joining me, and also to Daryl Devine, and the Daily Record video team who have produced this episode. You can listen to this episode and all others of Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or watch it on the Daily Record YouTube channel. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast. So it's goodbye from me. I think Paul will be back next week. But until then, cheerio for now.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.